Hello, my name is Clara Heberling, and I am a McConnell Scholar at the University of Louisville. As part of this year's programming, the McConnell Center has been producing a series of book bits, short segments that highlight the importance of reading influential works in American history. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Natalie Taylor, who will be discussing why we should read The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. Dr. Taylor holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Kenyon College, along with a master's degree in political science and a PhD in political theory from Fordham University. She currently teaches political philosophy at Skidmore College, with a focus on American political thought and feminist political theory. Dr. Taylor is also an author. She has written and published The Rights of Women as Chimera, The Political Philosophy of Mary Wollstonecraft, and is currently working on a book exploring the lives and ideas of Henry Adams, Henry James, and Clover Adams. Additionally, she was the editor to A Political Companion to Henry Adams. Also, Dr. Taylor has contributed 2 essays on Henry Adams' novels, titled The Landscape of Democracy and The Flowers of Freedom or the New Tyranny, Science, Art, and Religion in Henry Adams' Esther. On behalf of the McConnell Center, I want to say how excited we are to have Dr. Taylor with us today. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome as she shares with us why we should read The Education of Henry Adams.
Well, thank you for giving me a chance to talk about The Education of Henry Adams. It's a big book, as you can tell. There are other editions that are maybe not as large this way. They might be thicker, though, so you'll have to get in touch with your chiropractor and choose which one is best suited for you. Henry Adams dreaded what he referred to as the biographer's strychnine. Biography, as Adams saw it, has much the same effect on human beings as taxidermy has on animals. And so he described it this way, that at the hands of a biographer, the subject is skewered. It's put in a cage with pins stuck through it to keep the lively attitude of nature. So if you think about an animal that has been through taxidermy, then you're like, oh, it looks so real, it looks so natural, right? There's something that resembles the person, but not quite as Adams saw it. The Education of Henry Adams, which was only labeled an autobiography by its publisher after Adams's death, was Adams's effort to throw biographers off his scent. In 1907, Adams sent several copies of private published copies of The Education to his friends. He sent one to Henry James, and in the letter that he sent off with the book, he told James that the volume is a mere protection in the grave. And so he advised James to take similar precautions. He says, I advise you to take your own life in the same way in order to prevent biographers from taking it themselves. And indeed, Adams knew biographers' traps well. He was the great-grandson of John Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams, and the son of Charles Francis Adams. For generations, the Adamses had cultivated the habit of writing biographies of their forebears. Henry Adams avoided writing biographies of his family members, but he had published biographies of John Randolph and Albert Gallatin. Readers of The Education of Henry Adams, who reasonably expected that this book would be the next installment in the history of the Adams family, were surprised by the work. One biographer of the Adams family notes that the book was baffling to his family and friends. Henry's brothers found the book simply silly and jocose. Later generations of readers scratched their heads wondering how Henry Adams could view his education as a failure. It's throughout the whole book. My education was a failure. Oh, this attempted education was a failure too. The facts of Adams's life tell a different story. Sure, he never became president like his grandfather or great-grandfather, or even a member of Congress the way his father had. But he did enjoy success in those endeavors that he pursued. His largest, longest work of history was a history of the the Jefferson and Madison administrations, and it was called the nonfiction masterpiece of the 19th century. And in fact, this book, which was published publicly upon his death in 1918, won the Pulitzer Prize the following year. The Education of Henry Adams, the citation won the Pulitzer Prize for the best American biography teaching patriotic and unselfish service to the people, illustrated by evident example, including, he says excluding, and it's too obvious, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. So he doesn't rise to the occasion of Washington or Lincoln, but he is very successful in writing. And so the idea that he would be a failure in some ways is silly. He traveled extensively. He seemed to know all of the interesting and clever people of his age, and he had a chance to do a tremendous amount of things. So there is good reason to think that the Education of Henry Adams should not be read as an autobiography, that we can't quite trust it as an autobiography. Indeed, the Education defies category. It fits into the genres of literature and philosophy as easily as it does biography and history. And so what I'd like to recommend to you that you read it as a work of political philosophy, which examines the very nature of the American regime. And so in this regard, I'm indebted to political scientist James Young for his account of the Education. He makes the case that Adams had something much more ambitious in mind when he wrote the Education of Henry Adams than really just to tell you about his own life. But in telling his life, which he took to be emblematic of all of American history, so it was a modest claim, right? That he would be telling the story of America's transformation from a republic to a large-scale democracy, and then by the time that the work ends, an industrialized nation. So the tale of Henry's life is about our education as much as it is about his. And so what I want to do today is maybe talk about the important moments in Henry's life and also the life of the nation in order to better understand the American regime that Henry had devoted so much of his life to thinking about. So the first lesson of the Education of Henry Adams is, as Henry puts it, that life is a double thing. The book recounts the life of the fourth generation of a family uniquely associated with the American regime is also double. It is written in the third person. Henry Adams is both the author and the subject of the book. So when I refer to the author, I'll refer to him as Adams, but when I refer to the subject of the book, I'll refer to Henry. And maybe the two are the same, maybe they're not. Writing in the third person gives Adams a kind of philosophical detachment from his life. And it allows him to examine what he believed were perplexing, warring, and irreconcilable problems that he had confronted throughout his lifetime, and indeed that America had confronted. Adams does address this in the early parts of the Education of Henry Adams, but he explains that he was sort of raised with this idea to see everything as a kind of struggle and a kind of warring problems, as he puts it. So for Adams, the political life is of sharp contrast. And the questions that he's always bringing to bear in this work and his other works is how to reconcile those sharp contrasts. So America itself has a double meaning, and Adams brings this out on the first pages of the book. America was founded on small r Republican principles, so not the republicanism of the party, but of the kind of regime. And of course, John Adams was a good example of a good, virtuous Republican statesman. So there's that origin of the American democracy, but then there's also the element of America that's there at the inception of commerce and the commercial spirit that transforms the republic that Adams' family had helped to establish into a large industrial democracy is one that Adams wrestles with throughout the book. As Adams recounts his own life, he contemplates that transformation. And one of the ways that he shows us this transformation is by describing America's changing landscapes. So the double life of the man and the nation begins in Boston and in Quincy. In the opening paragraph, a landscape of one of Boston's oldest neighborhoods, Beacon Hill, is described by Adams. The State House and the church are central in this landscape of the early Republic. But there's a shadow cast from State Street, and that looms over these institutions of the early Republic. State Street is the place in Boston which was the financial and the commercial center, and it symbolizes, so these two things symbolizes are for Adams the warring and irreconcilable forces. Interest and profit, disparity of wealth, they threaten the virtues and equality necessary for a Republican self-government. As a young boy, Henry associated Boston with town, with winter, confinement, school, discipline, straight, gloomy streets. We've had about 6 months of winter in the Northeast. I'm not exaggerating, Tom. And so I'm sympathetic to his account of Boston. On the other hand, Quincy offered escape from town and restraint. Adams describes the lush landscape of nature surrounding Quincy. He says, boys are wild animals, rich in treasure of sense. Among the senses, the smell of the strongest, the smell of hot pine woods, sweet fern in the scorching summer noon, of new-mown hay, of plowed earth, of box hedges, of peach lilacs, of salt water and low tide in the marshes. Nothing came amiss. So Quincy is the opposite. It's natural, it's lush, it's freedom. And so these two landscapes, one of nature and one of civil society, that Adams paints in the opening pages are seemingly at odds for Adams. They're stark contrasts. So reconciling town and country, winter and summer, was not merely a biographical problem for Adams, it's also a political problem. And Adams shows us the solution to this problem in the example of his grandfather, John Quincy Adams, who was simply referred to as the president. So having just told us that the boy Henry associated school with winter in Boston, Adams recalls the president was compelled to walk the boy to school one hot summer day in Quincy. So there's another reason why, his brothers might say this is silly, this is nonsense. There's all sorts of inconsistencies. So on a personal level, the incident became an occasion for the boy to learn that his grandfather, while imposing and authoritative, was also patient and kind. Once Henry submitted to the constraints of attending school, he is admitted to his grandfather's library and allowed to play with all the material artifacts of 3 generations of Adams statesmen. Adams writes, he, meaning Henry, hung about the library, handled books, deranged papers that were presumably collected from the Adamses' public service. He searched old purses and pocketbooks for foreign coins, probably acquired during their many diplomatic missions. The wild animal, as Henry referred to the boys, had been tamed, and he was quietly learning to become an Adams, to uphold Republican principles and to learn the importance of public service. All of this in this example of John Quincy Adams walking the boy to school. Henry's rebellion also tells the story of the origin of American democracy. Adams' charming anecdote about the stern yet kind president explains the social contract on which America was founded. Quincy had been lush, a state of nature to Henry, yet his senses took in the smell of new-mown hay and plowed earth, the consequences of cultivating the land. So it wasn't simply natural. It had been farmed and cultivated by human invention. Government, according to social contract theories, is established to protect the fruits of human beings' labor, to protect our property, as the Declaration of Independence tells us. The formation of government entails a loss of freedom and a submission to authority, however necessary that may be. And so the Adams statesmen had always been suspicious of political authority and looked to the separation of powers and enlightened statesmen to mitigate the dangers of political power. And so as Adams writes, the warring problem of force and freedom could really only be solved by statesmanship, which was demonstrated by John Quincy as he walked Henry to school. Adams recalls, rarely has the boy felt kindly towards his tamers. Between him and his master has always been war. But republicanism promised a new type of authority, a new type of government, which relies less on force and more on virtue. The only use of force that the president relied upon was holding the boy's hand as he, walked him up the road to school. Holding someone's hand is an act of restraint, but is also an act of affection. Adams recognizes the act, as he writes, contrary to the inalienable rights of boys, but he also notes the president's manner and respect that it garnered. He says, he had shown no temper, he held his tongue. He uttered not one syllable of revolting cant about duty, of obedience, and wickedness of resistance to law. By not scolding Henry, John Quincy Adams respected the boy's freedom and tacitly acknowledges in a republic, submission to authority must be an act of free will. Can't be browbeat into respecting someone. The boy Henry came of age during America's greatest national crisis, the Civil War, between the industrializing North and the more agricultural, slaveholding Southern states. Henry Adams was enlisted to be his father's private secretary when Charles Francis Adams was appointed to be Minister of England at the start of the Civil War, and Adams spent the next 7 years abroad. Upon his return home, the country to which he was intimately connected, Adam recalls a sense of alienation. He writes, had Charles Francis and Henry been traders in the year 1000 BC, landing from a galley fresh from Gibraltar, they could hardly have been stranger on the shore of the world, so changed from what it had been 10 years earlier. Among the most impressive changes was the productive energy of Americans. Adams writes, the new American had no time for thought. They saw and could see nothing beyond their day's work. The new American was strikingly different than the American who moved through Adams' Boston and Quincy landscapes. Adams writes, above all, they naturally intensely liked being told what to do. They disliked being told, he goes on to say, by men who took their ideas and methods from the abstract theories of history and philosophy or theology. They knew enough that their world was one of energies quite new. So in other words, they disliked being told what to do by the likes of Henry Adams and his family. The new Americans had little use for the Adamses. Henry had headed to Washington to pursue a career in journalism. The landscape of the American regime had shifted from the revolutionary and early Republican towns to the nation's capital on the Potomac. Henry arrived in Washington as Andrew Johnson's administration was coming to close. The new Americans had elected Civil War General Ulysses S. Grant to the presidency. Henry, as he described himself as the child of the 18th century, naively drew the comparison between Grant and the Revolutionary War hero George Washington. Washington had established order and the first president of the Republic, and Henry believed that Grant would restore order to the broken nation. The spoils system had diminished the Senate's moral standing as Adams saw it, but it had solidified or even fortified its political power. Henry believed that the Senate must be brought, as he put it, back to decency. Henry was quickly disabused of the idea that Grant would be the person to do that. Grant, in contrast to Washington, was among the leaders for whom, as Henry describes it, intellect counted for nothing, only energy counted. And from Adams's perspective, he acquiesced to the corrupt partisan politics. At the same time, the emerging financial power of Wall Street was much greater than State Street. Adams described Wall Street as an empire within the Republic. Henry bore the distinctive mark of all Adamses, as he put it, an inherited quarrel with State Street, and he was ready for the fight. He took up his pen, which eventually led to writing an article called The New York Gold Conspiracy, in which he sort of lays out the attempt of Jay Gould, a railroad developer, to corner the gold market. Henry had assumed that the president and the Secretary of Treasury were involved, but in the course of his research, he finds out that President Grant had released millions of dollars of government gold into the market as a way to offset this attempt to corner the market. And so it looked like, at least at this time, that the government was able, or the leaders were able to take positive effect. He wrote that he feared what he referred to as the system of 1789, our Constitution, was breaking down, but the machinery of government kind of continued to sputter. Henry escaped from town by riding his horse in nearby Rock Creek, and Adams paints a landscape that seems, if only for a moment, able to reconcile town and country, restraint and freedom. He writes that the Potomac and its tributaries squandered beauty. The brooding heat of the prolific vegetation, the cool charm of the running water, the terrific splendor of the June thunder gust and the solitary woods were all sensual, animal, elemental. So all of this description reminds us of the necessity Adams had for this constant resistance to evil. But he wasn't so far out into the country that he could not see the Capitol. And he writes that Henry astonished himself by remarking that a purified charm was lent to the Capitol by the greatest possible distance. As one caught glimpses of the dome over the miles of forest foliage. So in other words, democracy, or American democracy, is majestic if you don't get too close, right? You've got to go out into the woods, far afield. Then you can look back on the workings of Congress and consider the majesty of democracy. Discouraged by the possibility of reform and likely dejected from not having received a political appointment himself, Henry accepted a teaching position at Harvard. Soon after his return to Boston, Adams married Marion Hooper, known as Clover, to her family and friends. The couple returned to Washington in 1877 so that Adams could do the necessary research for the history of the United States during the Jefferson and Madison administrations. Unsure that his work as a historian could have the widespread influence, or maybe it was just for fun, he chose to write 2 novels, Democracy and Esther. Both novels are tales about a young woman choosing a husband from among her suitors. In these novels, Adams considers 2 phenomena of the 19th century America. 1, the growing political corruption, and then 2, the eclipse of religion by science, respectively. So Henry's and Clover's happiness was short-lived. Clover sucked into depression and she took her own life. The 20 years that Henry was married to Clover and his most productive years are omitted from the education. In the years following Clover's death, Adams traveled to the Pacific. He spent quite a bit of time in Tahiti and in Europe. And despite, or maybe because of, his claims that his education had been a failure, Henry was immersed in the political and intellectual currents of the 19th century. He was particularly interested in the scientific theories and their ability to explain natural and social orders. Adams' late masterpiece, the Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres and Education, returned to the themes of his novels. In chapter 25 of the Education, it's entitled the Dynamo and the Virgin, Adams marvels at the motors that are on display at the 1900 exposition in Paris. He thinks about the Virgin that had been a force to inspire building of Europe's great cathedrals. But he's perplexed by the mechanical force and kind of wary of how it would propel Americans, maybe uncontrollably. And I think that we might be sympathetic to how Adams must have felt as we think about the own technological changes of our own time and wonder about the capabilities and the power that these new technologies have to overwhelm life as we know it. The last chapter of the Education opens as Henry approaches America in 1905. He's been abroad and he's recounting his approach into the harbor. And like the first chapter, the last chapter begins with a winter landscape, a landscape that is bursting with the features of an industrialized nation. There are no elements of the country to promise his readers freedom from the constraints of town. New York has replaced Washington, just as Washington had replaced Boston as the center of power in America. Adams describes the skyline. He writes, "The outline of the city became frantic in its effort to explain something that defied meaning. Power seemed to have outgrown its servitude and to have asserted its freedom. The cylinder had exploded and thrown great masses of stone and steam into the sky." The financial and industrial forces had continued to consolidate into great corporate powers. And similar to the experience of returning to America following the Civil War, Henry was struck by what he refers to as energy. Maybe today we would call them vibes. He says 10 times of that old type, this new energy was 10 times of the old type of his fellow citizens. Society required a leader with an energy, not sweet John Quincy Adams just quietly walking his grandson to school. It required someone like Teddy Roosevelt, who was just 42 years old when he became president in 1901. As the hero of the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt had more in common with Grant than he did with John Quincy Adams. He had the instinct of a fight, as Adams said. Writing to a friend in 1904, Adams reported with some degree of amazement that suddenly this week, without warning, Theodore Roosevelt, has hit Pierpont Morgan, the whole railroad interest, and the whole Wall Street connection, a tremendous whack square on the nose. As a student of mechanics, Adams anticipates the clash of forces between the energy of Roosevelt and the energy of the nation's financial power. And so politics had been reduced to this clash of energy. However, it's clear that Henry has no longer a part in this landscape. And he's a little bit brooding at the end of the book. He tells us that the old one, the old American type, had plainly reached the end of its strength. Yet Adams concludes the education with the possibility of a new, yet unimagined landscape in America. He writes, "Only beyond some remoter horizon could its values be fixed or renewed. Perhaps someday, say 1838, that was the year of Adams's centenary, Adams and his friends might be allowed to return for a holiday," he writes, "to see the mistakes of their own lives made clear in the light of the mistake of their successors. And perhaps then they would find a world that sensitive and timid natures could regard without a shudder." Adams died in 1918, and so he could not know that the horrors that would mark the 20th century. The education of Henry Adams is a double thing. It is the education of this historical figure, the fourth generation of an Adams. It gives an account of his own perplexing life as he paints these landscapes. But it is also our education. He educates us about the nature of the American regime, and he calls upon us to find a world or create a world in which sensitive and timid natures could regard without a shudder.